Hey, thanks for watching this video. Today we are going to replace the brake system on the front of a 2008 Honda CBR. So when this bike was crashed, somebody pieced it together with some parts that don't belong. This brake reservoir does not belong in this bike. This one actually looks like it's off of a Suzuki. If not a Suzuki, maybe a 900RR or an older motorcycle. It's not off of this particular bike. So in this video we are going to replace pretty much all the brake systems. We're going to replace this reservoir, we're going to swap out the fluid, we're going to put new brake pads on, and we're going to install Galfer braided brake lines. So first thing we need to do is drain all of the .4 out of the system. So I opened up the reservoir and I pulled all the fluid out of the reservoir, and now I'm going to pull the fluid out of the caliper. I always start with the farthest caliper first, and what you saw me pull off was the little cover that goes onto your bleeder nipple. Make sure your bike always has that cover. Anywhere that there's a bleeder nipple for the .4 in your car, .3, make sure that that rubber cap always gets back onto the caliper or wherever that fell off of. Once dirt and debris and moisture and water and other junk starts accumulating on that bleeder valve, it will stop working, and then you'll be in for a world of trouble next time you need to service your brake system. So always keep a rubber cap on that. That's my tip to you. It'll just make your life a lot simpler. If you don't have a cap, go get a cap. So yeah. So we're just finishing up. As you see, my little bottle is full, so the reservoir is completely empty. I've sucked all the fluid out of the system from the left side. Like I said earlier, we are going to put braided lines on here. I think braided lines clean up the front of the bike. Braided lines definitely look a lot better than these DOT rubber lines that the manufacturer installs. Here's another one of those covers. Set it aside somewhere safe so you always have that little cover available to you. So we shouldn't get a whole lot of fluid out of this side. Most of the fluid was already pulled through the other side, so there'll just be very little fluid that's going to come out of this side. So because when I started with this project, I realized that the brake fluid reservoir was wrong on the bike. This video actually took me a little bit more time, this project. I went ahead and ordered the correct reservoir, and I'll put that on later on in the video. But we're going to go ahead and put the brake lines on and set everything up. You will notice I'm not torquing anything in this video. My plastic will be here in a few days, so the front wheel has to come off. So I'm not going to torque the brake rotors back on. You do need to get your service manual out and figure out what your torque specs are. So this 14mm on the bottom of the brake master cylinder is the banjo bolt that holds your brake line onto the master. So we're going to take that off. Make sure you get a rag or a paper towel or something when you're taking this off. You do not want the .4 to get all over your bike. .4 is a just terrible corrosive fluid. It will destroy your paint. It will discolor your aluminum. So be careful with this stuff. When I'm taking apart a brake system, I always start with the top of the brake system. And it's always going to be the master cylinder up on the handlebars. It's going to be the top of the brake system. And then I work my way down. That way the hose can hang away from the bike and not get fluid anywhere onto the bike. I would rather have my brake fluid dripping on the ground where I can wipe it off the ground than dripping on my motorcycle and making an ugly stain somewhere. So this CBR, I'm building this for a friend of mine, Walter. You may get to see this bike someday racing up and down the street near you, or slaying a dragon, if you know what a dragon is. I'm hoping that he really loves this bike. We're removing the little bolt that holds the cable onto the fender. The one on the left side appears that it's already been removed. Maybe not, so we'll take the one off the left side. Like I said, it's been a while since I did this job. I'm just now doing the video right now, so I'm narrating this video as I watch it. Typically when I do a video for you guys, I'm working on the bike, and then I come in the evening and I go ahead and edit the video while it's fresh in my mind. So now that I have the brake line loose from the bike, I'm going to go ahead and remove the banjo bolt from the left caliper. That way I can keep this brake line again away from the bike. You do not want the brake fluid dripping on your wheels. Nothing good comes from that. Jump back over to the right side. Remove the banjo bolt. So once this is gone, we get the new brake lines in place and get everything flushed out. This brake system is going to work a lot better. It's going to function much better than the OEM. So I always use Galfer Braided brake lines. And when you're setting up brake lines, you want to make sure that you start at the bottom and your banjo is pointing away from the caliper. And you want to use 2 crush washers. So you're going to do a crush washer on the outside of the banjo, and then a crush washer on the inside of the banjo where it attaches to the caliper. A crush washer is simply just a copper seal that the brake fluid can't pass any liquid or air through. Anytime you do any service to your brake system and you mess or disturb one of these crush washers, you must replace the crush washer. So it's very important with your braking system because your life depends on it. Again, banjo bolt, crush washer, banjo, crush washer, and then install the banjo bolt into your caliper. So this bike is going to be red. I'm sorry, this bike is going to be blue. The owner, I asked the owner what his favorite color was, and he said blue. So I picked a cool color of blue. And then when I decided to do the brake lines, I chose red instead of like black or blue or a color match for the bike. Just so the brake lines kind of stand out. When he pulls into the parking lot, people see the red brake lines on the bike. So going into the master, it's going to be banjo bolt, crush washer, banjo, crush washer, banjo, crush washer, and then we're going to screw it into the master cylinder. So I'm going to tell you, don't ever install the banjo bolt with a wrench. Don't ever use tools to install the banjo bolt. You want to install these bolts finger tight, and you want to do it with your finger. But sometimes you can't get to where the banjo bolt screws into. So I'm using a deep well socket just to help me turn it. But again, I'm just turning it in finger tight. I'm not tightening this down. Um, I just didn't have enough room and enough strength in my fingers to line this bolt up to get it into the master cylinder. But you do not see this socket attached to a wrench. You do not want to use a wrench. When you put a wrench on it, you risk stripping out the threads inside of your master or in your caliper, and then that's bad. So yeah, don't use a wrench to put this all together, and put your banjo bolts in only finger tight. Don't tighten anything down until you're done. Right now we're installing the little bracket, and I like Galfer because Galfer actually gives you this little bracket that goes on the front of the triple tree to hold your brake line in place. Other manufacturers just sell you the brake lines, and you got to come up with a fancy way to get the brake lines to stay in place on the front of your motorcycle. But Galfer thought far enough ahead and said, you know, our buyers are going to want their bike to look pretty, so let's go ahead and give them this rubber coated little clamp that they can run their brake lines through. So look how nice this is on the front of your bike. So right there makes it worth the $100 that these brake lines cost. So now we have our brake lines all in place. Let's go ahead and remove our labels. The last thing you want to do is ride down the road and see those labels flopping in the wind in front of you. It's distracting. If you're an old fart like I am, you need the least amount of distractions as possible while you're riding. When you tighten down these brake lines on your master cylinder, you want to make sure that the brake lines are away from the fork. So get it tight. Take another wrench or something. I used a socket wrench, one of those things. I used a ratchet handle between the fork and the banjo to keep the brake lines away from the fork. This is going to allow you to adjust your controls. If your controls are out of place, once you get this all said and done, you'll be able to move your brake lever up and down, in and out, because you have room to play with it. Now we're going to jump down to the right side caliper, and we're going to tighten down the banjo bolt on this one. Do not over tighten these. That's the job of the crush washer, is to make a seal. I'm going to say on the instructions, I think it says like 17 foot-pounds for the banjo bolt. I could be wrong. Read your instructions when you open it up. 17 foot-pounds is not a lot. So don't go crazy and break your banjo bolt off in your caliper. Again, I have a new fender coming. That fender is going to be blue, and it's not going to have a big crack in the middle of it. And we're done with installing the brake lines. Now we're going to put some new levers on the bike. So this bike was pretty much bone stock when it was crashed. So I don't like the OEM levers that come on most bikes. So I put the shorty levers on every bike that I own. I have shorty levers. This bike is not my bike, but it is going to have shorty levers when it leaves my house. So for this bike, the shorty levers cost about 20 bucks for this set, and I think they make the bike look a lot better once they're on. These came from a CNC factory here in North Carolina. This is the bolt that the levers pivot on. You're going to want to clean that bolt up and put a nice coat of grease on it. On the CBR, you just have a manual clutch cable. So just pop that lever off the clutch cable. Here's your bolt. So this grease that I'm using is Lubrimatic marine grease. You don't need a high performance grease on here. You just need a grease that's going to hold up to dirt and debris and water and any other nasty crap that's going to get in there while you're riding down the road. Put a little on the inside of the control bracket off the handlebar. That way the lever will glide freely on the bike when you're using it. This cable's a little bit difficult once it gets pulled back into the housing. So use what you can. Make sure you don't destroy that little brass cover that's around the cable end. Pull the cable out. There's really not a lot of tension on that cable. You'll be okay. And then work that cable into your lever and then line it up and then put it back into the little clamp that holds the lever. So very important with this screw, when you put this screw in, if you don't have the lock nut that goes on the bottom of this screw on the other side, for your safety, please get that lock nut. Go to your hardware store, get a lock nut that'll fit on that screw so you're not riding down the road and that screw works its way out and your brake lever or your clutch lever pops off the bike, because that is no good. So we're going to put some tension back onto this cable. That's simply done by just turning this adjuster. And this is kind of preliminary. I haven't ridden this bike yet. That's going to be within the next week or so. I'll get this bike out on the road and make sure everything works on it and it's a roller and working good before I button it up with new plastics. But you just want to get your clutch cable to where it's tight. So when you screw that adjuster out, you want the cable housing to fit into that adjuster and be snug. And then you can adjust it later when you ride down the road. You can tweak your clutch and get that clutch feel that you're comfortable with. So right now I just finished installing that lock nut that holds that little bolt that your clutch lever rides on. So it's very important that you have that lock nut on your motorcycle. So if you don't have one, do make sure that you do get one installed. So for me to get to that lock nut, I had to move the controls around. So now I'm going to push the controls back down where they belong and tighten them down on the clip-on, so it'll be ready to go when I take the bike out for a ride. So right there, the clutch actually felt pretty good. Now we're going to jump over to the brake, and you can see that lock nut that's on the bottom there. As dumb as that little lock nut is, it could save your life, so do make sure you put that back on. Now we're pulling out the little bolt that your lever pivots on. The brake side is always the easiest, and if you're doing a bike that has a hydraulic clutch, it's super simple. It can get tricky when you're doing a bike that has that clutch cable though. Some clutch cables just don't give and they don't like to play like this one did pretty good for me. So I was happy with that. So again, I'm using Lubrimatic marine grease, and I'm just putting a little bit down in the hole, and I'm putting some on that pivot bolt. Put it inside where the lever rides. Some people will complain that their brake lever and their clutch lever don't move freely. It's a good idea annually, maybe in the spring before you start riding again, to pull your levers off and clean them up inside there. You'll find that your brake feel and your clutch feel will completely change once these levers are lubed up. When you're putting this pivot bolt back into place, sometimes it'll hang. If the lever doesn't get lined up just right, it might hang. Just push it in and push it through. Once it lines up properly, it'll go through the threads in the bottom. There's not a whole lot of play in this bolt. But I'm just off just a little bit. I'm off where the screw goes through. But you'll know once the screw hits the hole, you'll know when it's in there, and then you can just tighten it down. Like I said, I buy these milled CNC machined brake levers from a place in North Carolina. They're about 20 bucks. Pretty much everywhere you look on eBay for a CBR, they're $15 to $20. I buy them from one specific place, mainly because they're in North Carolina, and I can usually get them within 2 or 3 days of placing the order. So I just put that lock nut back on the bottom of the bolt, and I'm just tightening it down. And there you go. Now your brake lever's on. We've got new levers, gold adjusters, and now it's time to work on this reservoir and get the right one into place. So most guys wouldn't really care about having the wrong brake reservoir on their bike, especially after it's been through a crash. But anything down around my gauge cluster, on the handlebars, on the fairing, anything that's in front of me when I'm riding down the highway that's out of place, and I know it's out of place, just bothers me. So I don't know how you are, but I like everything on my bike to be the way it was meant to be from the factory, the way it's meant to look. So if I have a bracket on the reservoir that looks like somebody beat it with a hammer, and then I have the wrong reservoir on there, and I know it's the wrong reservoir, it's just gonna bother me while I'm riding. Every time I look down at that reservoir, it's just gonna bother me. So for $20, I was able to go out to eBay, find a used reservoir for a 2008 CBR, and put the correct reservoir back on the bike. So you see the hose that I'm removing right now. That hose is the wrong position. The hose had a kink in it because it was the wrong hose for the job. It's the wrong reservoir. So we got that old reservoir. Now let's look at the new one. The hose is the right length. It's got the correct clamps on it. So I'm putting the clamp onto the reservoir where the little spout comes off the bottom of the reservoir. I'm putting that clamp back on there. And now I'm going to move the other clamp down to the end of the hose, and we're just going to slide that hose onto the master. So without even bolting it up, you can look at this right now and you can see that this reservoir belongs on this bike. So simple as that. Just if you crashed your bike, put it back together properly. You don't have to be a rocket scientist and re-engineer your bike. Just do it right. Do it right the first time. It doesn't cost that much more money to put the right parts back on your bike. And used parts never hurt a motorcycle. So if you think you're going to save some money by buying a reservoir on eBay from China for $10, it's not going to look like the OEM reservoir that was on the bike. So there's the reservoir off eBay, $20. It's the correct looking reservoir. It looks better on the bike, doesn't it? You gotta agree it does. And now we're going to put brake pads into the calipers. So there's a few things I always use when I'm building the bike. I already showed you the Galfer braided brake lines. I can't think of a bike in the last 10 years that I've built that didn't have Galfer braided brake lines on it. And I can't think of a bike that I built in the last 10 years that didn't have EBC HH pads in the calipers. So simple enough. With this type of brake caliper, you just take your 5mm Allen wrench and loosen up the slides that your brake pads float on. And then we're going to take a 14mm wrench and we're going to break free the bolts which hold the caliper on. Now these bolts, when I pulled these bolts out, remember this bike was crashed. I would say this bike was totaled 3 to 4 years ago, and this bike has sat since then. So when I pulled these bolts out, these bolts are pretty bad. They're pretty corroded. And lucky for the owner, see the corrosion on these bolts? To me, that's hideous. When I started on this bike, whenever I start building a bike, I go out to eBay and I buy the bolt kit for the bike that I'm building. So I find recyclers who are parting out a CBR 1000, and all the bolts that they pull out of that bike, typically they throw them down on their workbench, and once that bike is dismantled, they take all those bolts and they throw them in a box and they sell them. Well, I bought 2 bolt kits for 2 different CBRs for under $50 shipped to North Carolina. So those 2 caliper bolts that I took out of the bike, I looked up the price on those. They're $12 each. So at $12 each, I replaced all 4 on this bike. It paid for the bolt kits. And I still have all the bolts to put the fairings back on. There were some other bolts that held the subframe on that were missing. I have those bolts. Those have been replaced. So any bolt that I need for this bike, I have on my workbench. So it's a good idea for you if you're working on a totaled bike and there's a lot of stuff ripped off of the bike, or you bought a CBR really cheap and you're putting it back together like I am. just jump on the internet, jump on eBay, and get you a couple bolt kits so you have extras. I have one of those little hardware tray drawer things, and it's full of Honda bolts. If I had to go to Honda and buy each one of the bolts that are in that little hardware caddy, I would have thousands and thousands of dollars worth of Honda bolts. But I'm at the point now that I've built so many Hondas over the years that if I need a bolt for a Honda, I know exactly which tray to go grab the bolts out of, and they're ready to go. I don't have to go to the Honda dealership and buy new bolts or go to Bike Bandit or something like that. So right now I'm simply just cleaning out the inside of the caliper. I have a solvent tank, and in that solvent tank I have Simple Green. So I just took a scrub brush and I dipped it in the solvent tank, and I'm scrubbing down the caliper. Simple Green is a safe chemical. It's not going to destroy anything. It's not going to discolor your caliper. It will get the grease and grime, dirt and debris out of the inside of your caliper, and you'll be good to go. So there you go. That caliper's pretty clean right now. The garbage is off all the pistons. I can push some pistons in safely without any problems. And I'm just going to take a paper towel and I'm going to shove it in there and clean all the excess Simple Green off the inside of the caliper. So these are the old brake pads. I just dropped them back in there so I could push those pistons back into the pots. My new brake pads are much wider than the OEM brake pads that I took out of there. So here are my EBC HH. We're going to take those out. On the back of the OEM pads were a little metal clip. We want to make sure that that metal clip gets onto the back of the new brake pads. That metal clip will stop your brakes from squealing and scratching and making weird noises when you apply them. It also helps dissipate heat between the pistons and the brake pads. When the brake pads are in full force, creating friction, that heat gets transferred into your caliper and then into your brake fluid, and it wears your brake fluid out a little bit quicker. So here we just put the pads in, but I have not cleaned the pins that the brake pads float on. So I have to set this caliper off to the side, and I just took some 4/0 steel wool, and you want to do this with your pins as well. You want to just scrub them really good. These pins are in kind of bad disarray. If I had some new pins, I would have replaced them, but these are still serviceable. They're just not as pretty as they should be. But we're just scrubbing the debris off so our brake pads will slide freely on these pins. When you grab a handful of brakes, you want your brake pads to slide on these pins and not get hung up on any burrs or debris or anything like that. The guy that owns this bike is a good friend of mine, and I love him dearly, and I don't want to see anything happen to him. So the safer I can make this bike for him, the happier I'll feel knowing that he's racing around the mountains with a big old smile on his face, and I know he's going to make it home this evening on these brakes when I'm done with this bike. So here are these corroded caliper bolts, and these are the ones that I got in the kit. You see they're like brand new. Most of you guys go out and you'll buy a CBR 1000RR, never having ridden a motorcycle before in your entire life, and then you'll crash it with only a few thousand miles on it and total it out. Well, it's bad for you, but it's great for me because I need parts. So if I can buy parts off of a bike that's been crashed with a few thousand miles on it, those parts are like brand new. So all you squids out there wadding up your motorcycle, thank you. You're doing your other riders a huge service when your bike makes it to the salvage yard and somebody takes it apart and puts those parts on the internet for sale. My buddy that owns this bike, he is very grateful because I have saved him thousands of dollars on parts that this bike needed to be put back together. If you want an example, just go to the parts fish and look up all the parts to put the ram air back together. That's going to be my next video, is building the ram air. Those parts were over $700. I was able to get it down to $300 with used parts. So we're just lining up the brake pads in the caliper. Once we get the brake pads in there, once you slide them in, you kind of have to manipulate that spring on the back side to get those brake pads to align properly. And you see how corroded the old bolts were, and that corrosion's really just from the bike sitting. It's called lot rot. So these are the bolts that I got inside one of the bolt kits that came from eBay, and those bolts look like they're brand new. The only time they came off the last bike was after the bike was totaled. That bike that they came off of, I would even guess it had OEM tires on it without looking at it, because these bolts had not been in and out of the fork at all. It looked like they had just been taken out of the fork and done. So when you guys are going out buying yourself a brand new motorcycle and it's a CBR 1000RR, you know, be careful. The CBR 1000RR, or even the new one, the CBR 1000RRRRRRR, because you can never have too many R's. That's a massive, powerful machine, and it will hurt you very quickly. So if you're looking at buying your first bike, you might not want to get a leader bike to be your first bike, or you're guaranteed to take a soil sample. Maybe try a 600RR. I personally find it is more fun to ride a slow bike fast than to attempt to ride a fast bike and kill yourself quickly. So I loosened those pins that your brake pads slide on. We're on the left side now, and now I'm removing the bolts that hold the caliper onto the forks. Now this side, because it's the kickstand side, these bolts weren't as bad as the right side was. I'm going to assume that the right side was facing weather somewhere, and water, moisture got in and deteriorated those bolts. These aren't too bad, but since my buddy already paid for the bolt kit for this bike, and I had the bolts sitting on my workbench, they might as well go on his bike. You know, they're his bolts. I want this bike to be as nice as it was the day he bought it from Honda. I'm not going to be able to get it to showroom condition, but I can get it pretty close. As close as you can get a totaled bike, I guess. So again, these stock brake pads, they were still serviceable. Um, they probably had about half life left in them. But again, at $38 for a set of brake pads times two, um, you cannot go wrong with the EBC HH. If you're pulling apart a brake system and you're not replacing the pads while you have everything apart, you need to rethink your thought process on working on a motorcycle. Um, the OEM pads are good, but they are not as good as the EBC HH. So here's my steel wool, and I'm just cleaning all the dirt and debris and any burrs that are on this pin. So this pin will allow the brake pads to slide freely inside the calipers. I have heard of people putting a light coat of grease on here. You will not see me putting grease on a brake system. I'm one of those guys that doesn't believe that lubricants and braking systems should go hand in hand. I like my brake systems to function and work 100%, and if you introduce a lubricant to your brake pads and your rotor, you are not going to get the braking efficiency that the manufacturer had expected out of this. With my luck, introducing lubricants to a braking system is a great way to meet the side of a guardrail. So I like my brake system to be dry and 100% serviceable. So again, this is just simple green. I'm just scrubbing out the caliper with simple green to make sure all the dirt and debris and cobwebs and junk that's inside the caliper is out of the caliper. And in here I'm just taking my old brake pads and pushing those pistons back into the caliper. So when I put my new brake pads in, this caliper will slide over the brake rotor smoothly. I won't have to fight it to get it onto the brake rotor. So we're good to go. We're just going to take a paper towel, wipe down the inside of this caliper. This video was shot during coronavirus in April of 2020, and paper towels are a hot commodity in my area. There are no paper towels, there's no toilet paper on the shelves. Fortunately, I have a stockpile of paper towels. Anytime they're on sale, I was going out and buying paper towels, because when I'm building the bike, I can go through some paper towels. So these little clips, take these off of your old brake pads. Make sure they go on your new brake pads. They may look like a worthless part to you, but they are very important for your safety and the safety of your motorcycle. So make sure those little plates get on the back of your new brake pads. Slide your new brake pads into place. With that little spring in the back, it makes it a little bit difficult for that pin to get in there. You have to line everything up just right. It's really a pain in the ass. I think they could have made it a little bit easier, but again, like most manufacturers, Harley Davidson one of them. If you make the job too easy, then your customer stops coming back in for service. So if they make the job very difficult, then you're going to bring the bike back to the dealership for service, and they're going to get paid. They'll get paid on the motorcycle sale. They'll get paid on all the service that they do for you. I don't have a dealership within an hour and a half of my house, so I have to do a lot of the work myself. But I've only been working on motorcycles for about 35 years. I wouldn't take it to the dealership anyway. My money's too valuable. And at this point, I'm too old to be wasting my money at a dealership. I like to ride too much. If I'm wasting all my money having the dealership fix my motorcycle, then I can't afford to put gas in my bike. So there's the old bolts and the new bolts. You see the new ones, they're almost perfect. So I'm going to use those just because they're going to make the bike look that much better. Even the head of the bolt that's going to be showing at the end of the caliper looks better. It's not all beat up from a bunch of wrenches being on it. It just makes the bike look cleaner, unmolested. And isn't that what we want? Just a clean, decent bike to ride around on? I know I do. Again, as I told you earlier in the video, I'm not torquing these down right now, but if this is your final stage, you do need to torque those bolts down. I still have to pull the front wheel off and put a new front tire on this bike, put a new front fender on the bike. So I'm going to do that later. So I'm not torquing down those calipers. We're at the point now where we're going to add brake fluid. So this is the new reservoir that I put on earlier in the video. I just opened the cap. There is moisture in there. When you pull your cap off, there is going to be moisture underneath your cap between the little black, I don't know what you would call that, diaphragm. But inside the diaphragm, where the diaphragm meets the cap, there's going to be moisture. Brake fluid, especially dot 3 and dot 4, absorb moisture. It will pull moisture in from the outside air. So there's going to be moisture inside that diaphragm and on the cap. See the moisture on the cap? So you want to make sure that everything is dry when you start working on the bike. And when you put it all back together, you want to make sure that all this is clean and dry. Moisture is going to get into your brake fluid fast enough. If you're buying a bike, one of the things that I look for when I'm buying a bike is the color of the brake fluid, the color of the clutch fluid. That is a telltale sign if a bike has been serviced properly in its lifetime. So you all know, and you can watch this video when I dump the brake fluid in. We're going to use this Bell Ray. This brake fluid's a little bit more expensive, but the guy who owns this bike, he is absolutely worth it. So I want to keep him safe. So we're going to put the Super Dot 4 in there. As I dump it in, you see the color. See it? See it? It's clear. It's like a clear yellow color. See what color the reservoir is? You really can't even tell that there's brake fluid in there. If you're buying a motorcycle and you can see the brake fluid and it is clearly a brown color, tan, beige, brown, black, brake fluid should not be that color. So yeah, that's something that you can haggle over, because in your mind you're going to know that this bike hasn't been serviced 100% if it has the wrong color brake fluid in it. The other one's going to be the coolant color. If it's not a bright green or a bright orange color, if it's like some nasty muddy green color coolant, you know that coolant's never been replaced. So chances are the bike hasn't been serviced properly in its lifetime. What I'm doing right now is I am bleeding the master. So really the master, I just wanted to make sure that I get clean fluid into the master and I get clean fluid through the hose from the reservoir down into the master before I even get started. And then I just tighten that bleeder valve down, and then I'm going to go to the left side. So when you're bleeding a system, it's always a good idea to start with the farthest away from the master first. So the farthest bleeder valve from the master is where you're going to bleed first. This is going to be on your motorcycle, on your car, on your pickup truck, on your bulldozer, whatever you're bleeding, whatever breaks you're bleeding. Start with the bleeder valve farthest away first and work your way towards the front of the vehicle. So the tool I'm using, and I get a lot of questions on this, so I'm using a MityVac vacuum pump. There's several different versions of the MityVac that you can buy. I'm using the more expensive one. It has a little gauge on it that tells me how much pressure, how much vacuum pressure I have. You can get by with the cheaper one. It's maybe $5 cheaper not to have that gauge on the top. You can pick up your MityVac from a Harbor Freight. They're usually on a top shelf, hidden away. They want you to buy the Harbor Freight model before you buy the MityVac, is all I can think of, because their generic piece of crap vacuum pump is front and center, and you kind of have to look around on the shelf. And it's usually, if you see their generic crappy vacuum pump, if you look up above it on the top shelf out of your eyesight, you'll see MityVac vacuum pumps hidden. Buy the MityVac, pay the extra $10. It's only like $40 for this vacuum pump that I'm using. Spend the $40. It's the best $40 you're ever going to spend if you're doing your brake systems. If I were you, and I'm riding my motorcycle regularly, I'm going to change out my brake fluid annually. So in the spring, before I start riding, I'm going to put fresh brake fluid in my bike, front and rear. I'm going to bleed my clutch. If you have a Ducati with the hydraulic clutch, you know you got to bleed that clutch all the time. This MityVac makes it just simple, smooth. It's an easy operation. When I'm doing tires on for folks, I'm putting new tires on their motorcycle. If their brake fluid is dark, discolored, I have no problem charging them $15 to swap out their brake fluid. It only takes 10 minutes to flush out a brake system. So with this MityVac tool, it'll pay for itself within the first year of ownership. I probably have 5 of them, and all 5 of them have easily paid for themselves in the time that I've owned them. So don't hesitate. Just walk into Harbor Freight. It's on the top shelf. Grab one and use it. I promise you, you're going to love it. MityVac. If you don't have a Harbor Freight nearby, they're on eBay. Typically, they're cheaper on eBay. You can get them $40 shipped to your house. I haven't gone out to Amazon to see how much they are on Amazon, but I'm sure they're there. I'm not really a big Amazon fan. My wife is. Even though we have Amazon Prime, it never seems like we get our packages in a timely manner. So, you know, you do what you do, but I'm going to stick with Harbor Freight and eBay. If I'm going to buy a new vacuum pump, I usually buy 2. So there you go. This brake fluid is terrible on a MityVac. I will warn you of that. when you're done using your MityVac, it's not a bad idea to rinse it off with some water, um, wash it off so it's good to go next time. So we're almost done with this brake system. Right now we're into the video for 55 minutes. This video was an hour. If you watch the entire video of this brake service, I just want to say thank you. I make a very tiny bit of money from Google for these videos that I do. I mainly do them for you, so you can see how the average rider is maintaining his bike. I by no means am a certified mechanic. I was a mechanic back in the day, 30 years ago when I was much younger. I am not a mechanic anymore. This is just a hobby for me. Working on motorcycles, I do this just for my own sanity. I like to have nice motorcycles. I don't have a lot of money, so I'll go and I'll buy a busted up motorcycle and put it together myself. And the money that I save putting together somebody's busted up motorcycle and making a nice motorcycle, I'll go out and I'll ride it around for a season, and then I'll take that motorcycle and I'll put it up for sale at the end of the riding season. And that money that I make off that motorcycle allows me to buy another motorcycle. So I get to ride a lot of nice motorcycles without having to spend a lot of money, just because I'll buy a busted up motorcycle and throw some money at it to make it nice and make it to where I like. So this is a little trick I learned. A friend of mine, he's passed now, Regan Shaw, taught me this. Pump up your brakes and then put a zip tie around your handlebar and your brake lever and hold that brake lever tight. Let it sit overnight. It forces all the air in the system to the top and out of the lines, and it really gives you great feel for your brake system when you're done. Same with the clutch, but it's a great tip. So once you're done with your brake system, go ahead and make sure that all your bleeder valves are tight. Those little rubber caps, make sure those little rubber caps get back onto your bleeder valve. Do not ride your motorcycle without having a rubber cap on your bleeder valve. Don't ride your motorcycle without having a cap on your tire valve stem. So we're going to put our reservoir back together. We're going to clean our cap, make sure there's no moisture, no dirt, debris inside your cap when you put it back on. Clean it up nice. The little ring that goes in the diaphragm, make sure that that's clean. Make sure your diaphragm's nice and clean and dry. Top off your dot 4. You want to go almost to the full line. Your reservoir is a good means to tell how much brake pad, how much brake surface you have. As you use your brakes and your brake fluid goes down in your reservoir, that's how much wear you're getting on your brake pads. So if you know that your brake fluid was full when you started this mission, and now you got 10,000 miles on the motorcycle and your brake fluid is halfway down the reservoir, you know your brake pads are worn out halfway. So time to start thinking about replacing your brake pads. So with the reservoir on, now we're going to put our little retaining clip. This little clip just holds against the reservoir cap to make sure that that cap doesn't spin freely going down the highway. I personally have never seen a reservoir cap spin free, but Honda, Suzuki, Kawasaki all thought that that little thing was important. We're putting our cap on to protect our master bleeder valve on the master cylinder. You see the color of the brake fluid? That's the proper color. That's the way it should always look. Thanks for watching my video. Please watch some of my other ones.